It's a pleasure to be recording a presentation for the Economics of Happiness conference in Jeonju. I understand Jeonju is a place where local food traditions have contributed to awareness of the potential for food as a foundation for relocalized economies. I am speaking to you from Hepburn in the heart of the Mineral Springs district of central Victoria, 120 kilometres from Melbourne, Australia. Our community is a place where we've made small beginnings in this same direction, driven by passion about farming and food culture. This presentation draws strongly on my focus in this bioregion to show how permaculture design thinking can further contribute in weaving together the threads necessary for a relocalized food system. Hopefully, you will be able to translate from the Australian context to very different landscapes and cultures where you live and work. My writing, designing, and teaching about permaculture over more than 4 decades has strong parallels and crossovers with many of the themes in this conference. So, what is permaculture? And how can it help us design relocalized food systems? It's about people and food. It's about working with nature. It's about energy and materials. And it's about community. But in its essence, it's a design system for sustainable living and land use. It's based on universal ethics and design principles. It's also a grassroots and international movement of practitioners, designers, and organisations. And for many people, it's an empowering response to environmental and social crisis. The core and foundation of permaculture are the ethics, care of earth, care of people, and fair share. In different ways, these were common to all traditional cultures of place, but are largely absent in economies dominated by globalized capitalism. The 12 design principles are thinking tools to allow us to adapt and hybridize the best of multiple traditions and modernity, while we discard the dangerous and dysfunctional aspects of globalized industrial culture that are progressively destroying well-being and nature. I believe these design principles will be most powerful in futures of less energy and resources, whether that comes about by design or necessity. Permaculture and derivative concepts such as transition towns and Retrosuburbia differ from more mainstream sustainability concepts in many ways. The view of the future is one of energy descent, whether by planned degrowth or breakdown, where a combination of resource depletion, climate change, and other impacts of globalized industrial systems lead to a future of less resources and energy, while mainstream sustainability assumes a techno-stability, if not a techno-explosive future of continuous growth. The primary goal of permaculture is to build resilience to that assumed future, and while ameliorating the impact of past damage. Whereas mainstream sustainability is focused on ameliorating the impact of a future of growth. The primary strategy in permaculture is to rebuild localized parallel systems from the bottom up, more than to reform existing globalized systems from the top down. The processes used are primarily self-organizing, practical, cultural, and spiritual, more than policies, planning, and economics. And there is a stronger focus on biological and behavioural systems more than the built environment and technology. Of course, there are crossovers and complementarities in these different approaches, but these differences are important to keep in mind when considering any vision for and activism to rebuild localized food systems. The most universal application of permaculture has been the redesign, retrofitting, and revaluing of garden farming, where householders provide a substantial proportion of their perishable food as part of the household and community non-monetary economy. Although garden farming is only one part of the permaculture vision, I believe its reinvigoration is fundamental to rebuilding diverse, resilient, and relocalized food systems. Gardening, to provide our food and other needs, is a politically powerful act in affluent societies where most people are totally dependent on earth-destroying ways of providing their daily needs. As well as food security in increasingly uncertain times, permaculture designed gardens using organic methods contribute to maintaining our health and that of the earth by conserving precious water, energy, and other resources. Most important, permaculture designed gardens restore and nurture the life in the soil, which is the fundamental expression of our love of the earth and the foundation for future health and abundance. In the Australian context, where most people live in low-density settlements, garden farming has the potential to supply a very significant proportion of our diet. While monetary transactions dominated by corporations and governments prevail in the globalized monetary economy, the crisis-driven transformations currently underway are likely to radically shrink the size of the monetary economy, while growing the non-monetary and informal economies at the household and community level. While these transformations will involve pain and suffering, they also offer unprecedented opportunities to build localized degrowth economies from this non-monetary base, at least as effectively as can be achieved by reform of the monetary economies. I believe governments will continue to support and further subsidise large-scale globalised food systems dominated by corporations as the energy descent crisis intensifies. This is one of the defining characteristics of my brown tech future scenario. However, this difficult context will still provide opportunities to rapidly grow alternative systems in the shadows of the old that complement ongoing efforts to reform globalized systems. My RetroSuburbia book and strategy uses this context to help energize the household and community non-monetary economies in Australia and similar countries with low-density residential living patterns. Published and printed in Australia in 2018, this 600-page book has sold over 10,000 copies at $85. Since the pandemic, the online edition has been released on a pay-what-you-feel basis, and this has been accessed by thousands more. And the RetroSuburbia Facebook community, which was growing slowly to 5,000 over the last 2 years, doubled in 1 month to over 10,000. RetroSuburbia is just one indicator of the resurgence of household and community non-monetary economies that happen in times of crisis and contraction of monetary economies. So why suburbia? Suburbia is where the majority of Australians live and the place where many have some knowledge and experience of gardening. It's where a critical mass of people needed for community networks and economic exchange occur more than in rural areas. There is enough available space, soil, and sunlight to grow food, raise small livestock, and engage in other activities to sustain and maintain household and community economies. There is the ability to achieve scale of impacts by replication of successful systems across neighbourhoods. Permaculture design can be used to identify food production zones across settlements and their associated bioregional hinterlands. In countries with higher density settlements, such as South Korea, the distinction between the food-producing hinterlands and the food-consuming city is stronger. But in countries where low-density suburban settlement patterns predominate, the opportunities to re-ruralise settlements with food production are the strongest. Around any urban or industrial centre, there is generally a lower density suburban area where various forms of garden and urban agriculture can make use of private and public space. Beyond the urban fringe of most settlements, agriculture is the dominant land use, occupying more gently sloping and flat arable land. Further out, managed rangelands and forests occupy steeper and less fertile land, while reserves are predominantly on the steepest and most remote land. Rural zones are much larger, but have lower yields per hectare and mostly managed by machines and animals. Urban zones are smaller and have the highest yields, mostly managed by people. So garden farming in the household, along with commercial and community urban farming in the suburbs, has comparative advantage in perishable, high input, high value, intensive production. In Australia, these suburban systems could produce most of the horticultural and small livestock products. The rural hinterland has comparative advantage in non-perishable, low input, low yield, extensive production. Broadacre farming can produce most of the staples, larger livestock products, and some tree crops for commercial sale through local and central markets. The flow of produce to settlements from farmland needs to be balanced by a return flow of surplus nutrients from towns to farms. So if we look at these zones starting from the outer zones, in Australia, the lowest fertility, steeper and semi-arid hinterlands that are not viable for farming and more intensive grazing will be important to any viable bioregional economy in energy descent futures, especially those involving more severe climate change. Climate change will limit the scope of viable agriculture, while rangeland grazing, beekeeping, wild harvesting, hunting and forestry for fuel and timber, eucalyptus oil, etc. from marginal lands are likely to be more resilient than agriculture. Water, soil and biodiversity conservation are critical ecosystem service functions performed by these Zone 4 landscapes. Healthy hydrologies that sustain irrigated agriculture and human settlements may be the most important value from these watershed landscapes. In relocalised economies, the majority of the managed wildlands could be some sort of expanded commons managed by decentralised communities of interest that could include urban and suburban consumers. Within these natural but managed landscapes, there should always be the ecological reference areas, special reserves, and sacred sites where observation and inspiration take place without imposing management objectives, what in permaculture language is called the Zone 5. Zone 3 is mostly flat or gently sloping land with stone-free and moisture-holding soils suitable for cultivation without significant risk of erosion and degradation. It can produce the majority of dryland staple grains, legumes, and oilseeds. The limited areas of prime arable land and the unstable climates of Australia suggest little, if any, of this limited land should be allocated to growing non-food crops, such as fibre and fuel. Soils with moderate to good rooting volume and fertility on moderate slopes that are less suited to annual field crops could be mostly growing broadacre tree crops, especially olives, carobs, nuts, and fruit for drying and or processing. The majority of farmland in southern Australia is non-arable and only suitable for unirrigated pastures and animal fodder tree crops. These same areas easily produce wool and other animal byproducts and are suitable for timber plantations. Most of this production is likely to be commercial to support the needs of town residents. Commercial urban agriculture is likely to be concentrated in the lower density, newer outer suburbs built since the 1990s, where there is much less growing space in private gardens, but ample public and private land, much of it in mown grass. As well as intensive production of perishable vegetables and fruit, urban agriculture on larger areas could produce staple crops, especially starch roots, pumpkins, and corn, as well as tree crops, and involves small-scale dairy. Another key opportunity from these outer suburbs is the large roof areas of warehouses, light industrial areas, and shopping centres that could be used to supply irrigation water. The Zone 1 is really the low density older suburbs with more modest houses that are featured in RetroSuburbia and are likely to be capable of producing much of the vegetables, fruit and plant nursery products, as well as small livestock products consumed by the residents. Unfortunately, two factors currently reduce the productive potential of garden farming in these leafy suburbs: large evergreen trees and ongoing infill development of larger houses and apartments covering and shading garden space. The deflation of the Australian property bubble is likely to see an end to the counterproductive infill development. In these older suburbs, attached solar greenhouses in the cooler climates of southern Australia have the potential to produce seedlings and early produce while heating adjacent housing in winter. The Plummery in Northcote, Melbourne is a case study from the RetroSuburbia book, and it has demonstrated the productivity of small-scale permaculture designed garden farming. This table, published in the RetroSuburbia book, shows increasing yields and in recent years the goal of 0.5 tonne of food from just over 100 square metres has been achieved 2 years running. The work to do this has been 1 day a week from the residents. Zone 0 is the higher density urban core of our cities and towns, and including fully industrialised areas. It has surplus water and nutrients, but space and sunlight are scarce. Aquaponics and mycology make best use of the built infrastructure and resources to produce high-value perishable vegetables, fish, mushrooms, and ferments. While some of this is likely to be done in the household economy, technical complexity and capital investment required suggest most production is likely to be commercial. Urban core areas will still generate surplus water for export to suburban agriculture, while surplus nutrients might be transported back to arable hinterlands. A substantial proportion of food currently consumed in urban cores is by non-resident commuters, mostly as lunches. In energy descent futures, a majority of commuters and shoppers bringing their own lunches with them will represent a substantial net input of food via the non-monetary economy, mostly from surrounding garden and urban agriculture. In Mediterranean climates of southern Australia, large evergreen trees, especially eucalypts, provide shade, wildlife habitat and shelter, but also compete with food gardens for light, water and nutrients, increase risk in bushfires, and impede solar gain to buildings in winter and photovoltaic panels all year round. Creative reuse of many of these trees and replacement with more limited height and predominantly deciduous food-producing trees will be required if suburban and urban areas are to achieve their food-producing potential. Replanting of appropriate urban forests along highways with lower vehicle speeds and contaminated industrial areas can maintain urban forests for their benefits without the downsides of poor siting and design. So to summarise, in urban and suburban landscapes occupying less than 12% of a bioregion, it should be possible to produce 50% of the value of food in the total bioregional diet. Rural farming on 30% of land might produce 30% of food value, with the remaining 20% coming from forestry and grazing land, including migratory beekeeping. It may appear that garden farming and urban agriculture could simply be doubled in scale to produce a complete diet, allowing the majority of the land to be returned to wilderness. But this is not likely to be the case, at least in Australian landscapes and climates. Farm, range and forest provide food and other space-demanding resources with much less human effort and less fossil fuel subsidy. These complementary foods are harder to produce at a small scale, while non-food products such as timber, fuel and fibres can be sustainably harvested without damaging the essential ecological services that these regions need to provide. In designing a sustainable bioregional food system for energy descent futures, there are big implications for diet. Conversely, the complex questions of what is a healthy and nutritious diet, let alone cultural habits and preferences, have huge implications for future well-being and land use sustainability. Using the average modern Australian diet as a base for comparison with what people eat who have been strongly informed by permaculture within our region, and allowing for the impacts of energy descent futures, I have speculated on how that might change for those sustained by the bioregional food system I have outlined. The main messages are that there will be a major reduction in dairy consumption, with most of the remaining dairy products being from goats, which are better suited to southern Australian climates than cows. a doubling of vegetable consumption, and an increase in grain consumption instead of feeding so much of it to livestock. A large drop in sugar and a minor increase in honey consumption. A decrease in beef and pig meats, a major increase in legumes, and increases in nuts, kangaroo, rabbit, other wild meats, and seaweed. This retrosuburban diet is not a prescription, but an average of diverse personal habits. These pie charts show that the diet might be divided between 4 different sources. Rural agriculture, which will be mostly commercial production. Harvesting from the rural wild landscapes that will be mix of commercial and household harvesting. Garden agriculture, of course, household non-monetary production, mostly in suburban areas. Urban agriculture would be a mix of commercial and community-based production, mostly in suburban areas. And of course, a small amount of urban wild harvesting by householders. In the Southern Australian context, urban and suburban food production could potentially produce half the diet for those sustained by a bioregional food system in an energy descent future of resource depletion, climate chaos, and multiple stresses on globalized industrial food systems. My expectation is that a bioregional food system feeding perhaps 1 million people, 20% of the population of Melbourne and the Victorian bioregion, is an achievable vision that could develop in parallel with an increasingly armoured industrial food system continuing to feed the majority over the next few decades. When the inevitable realities of energy descent futures eventually lead to the collapse or fundamental reform of the globalized food system, we could have an alternative to take its place without too much pain and suffering for those who remain dependent on those centralized systems. While the elements of this vision remain embryonic in our bioregion and Australia more generally, I believe painting this picture is an essential contribution to its emergence. My essay, Feeding Retrosuburbia from the Backyard to the Bioregion, provides a more detailed exploration for a local audience of this vision. I look forward to hearing about the other presentations at this conference and gleaning and translating what we can learn in our bioregion from the work that's being done in your region.